Welcome back to Macro and Mayhem. Usually when we talk about a major geopolitical crisis, there's this expectation of precision.
Right. Like it's a math problem with a single answer.
It's like breaking a bone. You go to the doctor, the x-ray shows that jagged white line on your arm. The doctor just points and says, there it is. That's the problem. It's binary, right? Broken or not broken. You know exactly what the immediate pain points are going to be, and, well, you know exactly how long the cast needs to stay on.
Yeah, and we really find that level of precision comforting, don't we?
Oh, absolutely.
We want the world of international affairs and macroeconomics to be perfectly categorized so that it feels, manageable. We want a clear villain, a clear victim, and a completely predictable outcome.
But when you actually step into the mechanics of global trade routes, specifically looking at the energy markets, that X-ray machine is fundamentally broken.
It really is. It's completely murky.
Yeah. We are looking at a diagnostic landscape today that is incredibly complicated. We're exploring a scenario, a geopolitical model today that completely rewrites the rules of the global economy.
And it all starts with a hypothetical, but I have to say, highly plausible stalemate in the Strait of Hormuz.
Right. And what makes this scenario so fascinating, and we'll get into the weeds on this, is that it doesn't predict some fiery apocalyptic end to the world.
No, not at all.
Instead, it predicts this grinding, decades-long shift that results in a highly insulated fortress America by the year 2036.
It is an absolutely fascinating, if a bit terrifying, macroeconomic rewiring.
It really is. But to be clear right up front for you listening, the mechanics of building this fortress involves some intensely polarizing political maneuvers.
Or very polarizing.
I'm talking sweeping executive orders, aggressive tariffs, bypassing environmental regulations.
Things that make people on both sides of the aisle very, very angry.
Exactly.
Okay.
So, our role here today is to act purely as mechanics. We are just looking at how this economic engine runs under these specific stresses, entirely independent of the political rhetoric. We are absolutely not endorsing any political viewpoints, parties, or politicians here.
Right, because if we get bogged down in, cheering or booing the politicians driving the car, we completely miss the mechanics of the engine itself.
Yep.
We'd miss the fact that the entire transmission of the global economy is being rebuilt while the car is moving.
Which is a crazy thing to try and do. So let's get right to the trigger event here. If a geopolitical standoff thousands of miles away in the Persian Gulf actually fractures global trade, how does that ripple through the system?
Well, it hits everything.
Right. I want to know how it affects your stock portfolio, your job security, or the price of groceries at your local supermarket.
Because it absolutely will affect all of those things.
Because the textbooks, they've always told us that a blockade in the Strait of Hormuz is basically the equivalent of an economic heart attack.
That's the classic model, yeah.
You shut down that waterway, 20% of the world's oil stops flowing, and the world just stops turning. But this scenario is challenging the very physics of how a modern blockade works.
It completely redefines it. I mean, the textbook definition assumes a blockade is a solid brick wall.
Right, like you line up battleships and nothing gets past.
Exactly. But modern naval warfare and geopolitics, they just don't operate with those clean binary lines anymore. In reality, a closure of the Strait of Hormuz operates much more like a leaky sieve.
Leaky sieve, I like that.
Or perhaps the better way to visualize it is a highly politicized toll booth.
Okay, I'm trying to picture the actual geography of this. The strait is, what, roughly 20 miles wide at its narrowest point?
Roughly, yeah.
But the actual deep-water shipping lanes, the ones that massive supertankers actually have to use, those are only a couple of miles wide in each direction, right?
Yes, exactly. And that narrow channel is entirely within the striking distance of land-based anti-ship missiles, drones, and those fast attack craft.
So it's incredibly vulnerable.
Highly vulnerable. But the analysis notes that Tehran isn't going to just throw up a brick wall and stop absolutely every single ship.
Why not? I mean, wouldn't that give them the most leverage?
Well, because doing that invites an overwhelming, unified, global military response. And that really doesn't serve their strategic survival.
Ah, right. It unites the whole world against them.
Precisely. Instead, they weaponize the friction. They create selective risk.
Selective risk. Okay, what does that look like on the water?
So if you are, say, a Chinese tanker, a Japanese tanker, or perhaps a tanker from a European nation that's willing to break ranks, and you are willing to pay the required political or economic tolls to Tehran perhaps paying in non-dollar currencies or offering diplomatic cover you can sneak through.
So it's essentially a protection racket.
That's a very good way to put it.
Like, you pay the mob, your storefront doesn't burn down,
Mm-hmm.
but if you're flying an American or British flag, you're just not getting through.
You were blocked, yes. And the mechanism of adaptation is what's really crucial here.
Okay, how so?
Well, the market doesn't just freeze up entirely. It bakes the danger into the price.
Right, the market always adjusts.
And this happens primarily through marine insurance.
Oh, of course. Lloyd's of London and all those guys.
Exactly. Institutions like Lloyd's designate the area a high-risk zone, and these war risk premiums, they just shoot into the stratosphere.
I can only imagine.
I mean, the cost to charter and insure a very large crude carrier can multiply tenfold overnight.
Tenfold, that's insane.
It is. And furthermore, any alternative bypass pipelines like, the East-West pipeline that cuts across Saudi Arabia to the Red Sea, those are suddenly maxed out.
Because everyone is trying to avoid the strait.
Right. They are pushed to their absolute physical limits to circumvent the choke point, but they simply do not have the diameter to handle the full volume of the strait.
So oil doesn't just spike to $300 a barrel and instantly kill the global economy.
No, it doesn't.
It just hovers at this structurally painful level, right? Say $120 a barrel, and it stays there for years.
Exactly. It becomes this grinding structural tax on the entire global system. It is a chronic condition rather than a fatal heart attack.
But wait, if everyone on Earth is paying this massive tax at the pump, how does anyone actually win this game of chicken?
That's the million-dollar question.
Because if it's a chronic disease, aren't all the major economies just slowly bleeding out together? I mean, who benefits from that?
Well, this introduces the concept of relative leverage.
Relative leverage.
Yeah, so if you look at this purely through the lens of absolute economic growth, yes, everyone takes a hit. Global GDP slows down across the board.
Right.
But geopolitical power isn't about absolute wealth, it's about relative strength.
It's the old joke about outrunning the bear.
Exactly.
I don't have to be faster than the bear. I just have to be faster than the guy running next to me.
Precisely. To understand the winners and losers here, we have to look at how this chronic energy tax affects different regions asymmetrically.
Because the damage isn't spread out evenly.
Not at all. The structural damage is incredibly uneven. So let's look at the first major casualty in this scenario, which is Europe.
Okay, poor Europe.
The analysis describes their situation as absolute industrial triage.
Triage. That's a strong word. Let's unpack the mechanics of that triage. I imagine heavy manufacturing takes the first hit, right? We're talking about places like Germany that are already totally starved for energy.
We are, and we really have to look at the sequence of events that brought Europe to this vulnerability in the first place.
Right. They didn't just wake up vulnerable.
No. In the early 2020s, Europe fundamentally decoupled from cheap overland Russian pipeline gas.
Right, for obvious geopolitical reasons.
Exactly. But to keep their lights on and their factories running after that, they had to make a massive existential bet on the global liquefied natural gas, or LNG, market.
And LNG, I mean, that isn't just gas flowing through a pipe. It's an incredibly complex physical process.
It is incredibly complex.
You have to take natural gas, cool it down to minus 260 degrees Fahrenheit so it condenses into a liquid.
Right.
Then you shrink its volume by a factor of 600, pump it onto these highly specialized thermos bottle ships, sail it across the ocean, and then regasify it at the destination.
It's a logistical miracle, really.
It is, but it's also inherently more expensive and fragile than just running a pipeline.
And crucially for this scenario, a massive chunk of the world's LNG export capacity comes from Qatar.
Oh, and Qatar sits exactly where?
Qatar sits squarely inside the Persian Gulf.
Wow. Okay, so their LNG carriers must pass through the Strait of Hormuz.
Exactly. So when that route is disrupted by this leaky sieve blockade, Europe's primary energy backup is fundamentally compromised.
That is a huge problem.
The scenario specifically highlights the German industrial core. So we're talking automotive manufacturing, steel production, and their massive chemicals sector.
Like the big complexes in Ludwigshafen.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, a chemical plant requires immense uninterrupted baseload power just to maintain the required heat and pressure for those chemical reactions. You can't just turn it off and on.
No, you really can't. And under this scenario, European heavy industry is looking at structurally doubled, sometimes tripled, baseline energy prices.
Tripled?
Yeah. And you simply cannot compete in a global market if it costs you twice as much to forge a ton of steel or synthesize a vat of fertilizer as it does your competitors.
The margins just disappear overnight.
They evaporate. So the result, according to the analysis, is a quiet but massive migration.
A migration of what? Workers?
Companies. We aren't just talking about bankruptcies here. We are talking about the largest European conglomerates packing up their capital, their blueprints, and their operations, and physically moving those factories.
Wow. And let me guess where they're going. They moved to the U.S. Gulf Coast.
You guessed it.
Right, where they are sitting right on top of the Permian Basin and basically the cheapest natural gas in the world.
Exactly. They flee to the United States to access cheap, secure domestic power. Europe effectively deindustrializes to save itself.
That is wild.
It is. Now, if we look at the other side of the global equation, China faces a different but equally severe squeeze.
Because China imports, what, roughly half of its oil from the Persian Gulf?
About a half, yes.
And while we established they can cut backroom deals and pay the toll booth to get their tankers through, that friction still raises their baseline manufacturing costs. It's not a free pass.
No, the friction cost is immense. But the rising cost of input energy is really only the first blow to China in this model.
Okay, what's the second blow?
Well, we have to follow the supply chain to its logical end. Who is China selling all these manufactured goods to?
The West.
Yeah.
The American and European middle class.
Right. And what happens to the Western middle class when global energy prices surge?
Oh, man. They experience intense, sticky inflation.
Exactly. The cost of fuel, heating, food, it all spikes.
And when consumers are dealing with that level of inflation on the basics, discretionary spending just collapses.
It absolutely craters.
They stop buying the extra flat-screen TV, the new patio furniture, the cheap consumer electronics.
Oh, wow. So China is hit with a devastating 1-2 punch.
Yeah.
Their raw material and energy costs for manufacturing go way up because of the Hormuz squeeze.
Right.
But they can't pass those costs on to the consumer because their primary customers in the West are tapped out by inflation and have just stopped buying.
So their entire export engine stalls out completely.
The margin squeeze is totally fatal to their export model.
I have to marvel at the geopolitical irony of this.
It is deeply ironic.
If Europe suffers this massive industrial flight and China's export engine completely seizes up, isn't the United States essentially becoming the king of a shrinking hill?
Essentially, yes.
It feels like we are just the cleanest shirt in a very dirty laundry basket, Like we survive, but the global economy around us is crumbling.
That's a great analogy. The U.S. absorbs the global shock, but it absorbs all the fleeing capital as well.
Right, because the money has to go somewhere.
Exactly. All that European industrial investment has to go to a safe harbor. And the United States, with its massive domestic consumer market and insulated energy grid, is really the only harbor left.
The only game in town.
And this dynamic is the absolute foundation for what the scenario calls the 2036 Fortress America.
All right, let's fast forward a decade and paint this picture for the listener. Because we are describing an America where the entire concept of the supply chain has been inverted.
It's a total paradigm shift.
What does this insulated, self-reliant country actually look like on the ground?
Well, the defining characteristic of Fortress America in 2036 is the complete death of offshoring.
The death of offshoring.
Yeah. For the last 40 years, the undisputed gospel of corporate strategy was to find the cheapest labor anywhere on the planet, usually in Southeast Asia, and stretch incredibly complex, just-in-time supply chains across the oceans to maximize profit margins.
Right, the globalization era. But this scenario argues that in a world where maritime choke points like Hormuz or, say, the Malacca Strait are constantly under threat, relying on a fragile supply chain isn't just risky.
No, it's considered corporate suicide by boards of directors.
Corporate suicide.
Yes. The vulnerability totally outweighs the labor savings, so the capital comes home.
And this creates a dual reality for the American citizen, doesn't it?
It really does. Let's start with the economic boom outlined in the projections.
Let's hear the good news first.
The U.S. is forced to develop a highly advanced, automated, AI-driven manufacturing heartland.
Because we don't have the cheap labor here.
Right, because the U.S. faces structural demographic labor shortages. The baby boomers have retired, and birth rates are generally lower.
So there simply aren't enough young people to staff traditional labor-intensive assembly lines anyway?
Exactly. So these aren't the gritty smokestack factories of the 1970s.
We were talking about clean rooms,
Yeah.
robotics, advanced fabrication.
It is entirely high-tech, and that creates an absolute premium on domestic talent.
Like an engineering renaissance.
Oh, absolutely. The analysis explicitly points out that if you have skills in engineering, data logistics, or advanced trades like, specialized welding or electrical grid management.
Or energy infrastructure.
Right. If you have those skills, you are looking at one of the most lucrative, stable job markets in modern history.
Companies will be fighting tooth and nail to hire you.
They'll be throwing money at you, yes.
Okay, that sounds fantastic, honestly, for my kids if they decide to go to trade school or get an engineering degree.
Oh, it's a great setup for them.
High wages, stable jobs, rebuilding the country's physical footprint. But, as I'm sure you're about to tell me, there's always a catch.
There is always a catch in macroeconomics.
What is the actual reality of living in this fortress when you take that high paycheck to the grocery store?
Well, the bill that comes due is the death of cheap stuff.
The death of cheap stuff.
Yeah. Fortress America will be a staggeringly expensive place to live.
Staggeringly expensive.
The scenario emphasizes that the era from, say, 1990 to 2020 was a complete historical anomaly.
An anomaly. How so?
Hyperglobalization was this brief window where we had calm oceans secured globally by the U.S. Navy, the integration of 1 billion low-wage workers into the global market, and very minimal friction.
Everything just works smoothly.
Right. And that unique cocktail is what allowed you to buy a closet full of fast fashion clothes or a new smartphone for incredibly low prices.
It was a massive deflationary force.
Exactly.
So to put this directly to you listening right now,
Mm-hmm.
if every tangible good in your house, from your refrigerator to your kids' toys to a gallon of milk,
Mm-hmm.
is structurally more expensive because it has to be made using high-wage domestic labor,
Mm-hmm.
or at least within highly regulated regional trade blocs like the USMCA with strict wage and environmental standards,
Right.
are we actually wealthier in 2036?
Mm.
Or are you just earning a larger number on your paycheck only to watch it evaporate because the cost of basic living has basically doubled?
That is the core trade-off. It is a fundamental shift in purchasing power.
So the numbers on the check go up, but the stuff in the cart goes down.
The model suggests you will have very robust nominal wages, but the cost of living will remain structurally high.
Because that geographic and labor arbitrage is gone.
Exactly. The arbitrage that kept prices artificially low for 30 years has just been destroyed. You are paying a massive premium for the security of knowing the product was made inside the walls of the fortress.
Which brings us to the physical reality of actually running a fortress.
Which is a massive undertaking.
Because powering a huge, high-tech industrial renaissance requires an unfathomable amount of energy.
Oh, the power demands are astronomical.
I mean, you have automated factories running 24/7, massive data centers powering the AI logistics.
Mm-hmm.
You need baseline power that never blinks.
Not even for a second.
But the current political and cultural momentum right now is entirely focused on a rapid transition away from fossil fuels, right? Toward green energy, EVs, solar, wind.
Yes.
But this scenario argues this is a massive geopolitical trap.
It is one of the most critical analytical pivots in the entire scenario.
Walk me through it.
The analysis outlines how a blind, rapid transition to green technologies without securing the supply chain first actually hands all economic leverage directly to Beijing.
Okay, I want to break down the actual grid engineering here. Because the slogan is that green energy equals energy independence, right?
That's the popular slogan, yes.
The wind and the sun are free, right?
Right.
So how does transitioning to renewables hand the keys to China?
Well, the scenario forces us to separate political aspirations from the actual laws of physics and chemistry.
Right.
Passenger electric vehicles are a highly visible symbol of the transition, and they will certainly grow. But passenger cars are a remarkably small slice of the overall energy pie required to run an industrial civilization.
Right. I mean, you can't run a massive post-Panamax container ship on a lithium-ion battery.
No, you cannot.
The energy density just isn't there. The battery would weigh more than the cargo.
Exactly. You cannot run heavy freight trains, aviation, global shipping, or, frankly, military hardware on current battery tech.
It's physically impossible right now.
Furthermore, the analysis heavily emphasizes the foundational role of petrochemicals.
Electrochemicals.
Right. But when we think of oil, we usually just think of fuel to burn.
Gas for the car.
But oil is the foundational chemical building block for modern life.
We're talking plastics.
The plastics in medical devices, the fertilizers that keep global crop yields high, the synthetic fibers in our clothing, the asphalt on our roads.
And you can't forge industrial steel with a solar panel. You need intense, sustained heat.
Exactly. But the more pressing vulnerability the scenario highlights is the supply chain for the green transition itself.
Okay, let's get into that.
It provides the staggering reality check regarding critical minerals. Beijing currently controls roughly 80% of global lithium processing.
80%.
Yes. And they control roughly 70% of global EV battery manufacturing.
Okay, let's linger on that word for a second. Processing. Because they don't necessarily mine all of it within their borders.
Right. Yeah.
They buy the raw ore from Africa or South America, but the actual toxic, energy-intensive chemical processing required to turn raw lithium into a battery-grade material that happens in China.
Because China spent the last 2 decades heavily subsidizing that specific capability.
While operating under vastly lower environmental standards than the West, I assume.
Exactly. The West was perfectly happy to offshore the pollution and just buy the finished cheap batteries.
Out of sight, out of mind?
Yep.
This is a wild realization. If we discard our domestic fossil fuels, the natural gas and light sweet crude we have in absolute abundance here in the U.S., before we have built our own domestic lithium processing plants and battery factories, we aren't building an independent fortress at all.
Not even close.
We're just swapping our handcuffs.
That is exactly what we're doing.
We're trading a historical dependency on the Strait of Hormuz and the Middle East for a direct, total dependency on the Strait of Taiwan and Beijing.
That is the exact geopolitical trap the scenario maps out.
It's terrifying.
To build a true fortress, the projections imply a sequence of operations is mandatory.
Sequence of operations. What comes first?
You must rely on your domestic oil, gas, and nuclear power first.
To ensure baseline energy security.
Yes. Absolute baseline stability. You use that stable foundation to buy the time necessary to build out a sovereign, domestic, green supply chain, and then you make the transition.
Right.
If you mandate the transition before the domestic factories exist, you surrender your economic sovereignty.
Recognizing this vulnerability, this scenario doesn't just assume the free market will fix it, does it?
Oh, definitely not.
Because the free market wants the cheapest battery, which means buying from China.
Yeah.
So the scenario details some incredibly aggressive, almost authoritarian moves by the U.S. executive branch to force this reality into existence.
It does.
We're talking about weaponizing tariffs and emergency powers to override normal economic rules.
Because the administration in this scenario realizes they cannot afford to wait a decade for the free market to slowly realign.
The world is fracturing right now.
Right. If the global system is actively fracturing, they need supply chains onshore tomorrow. So they use executive power as a very blunt instrument.
Let's talk about the tariffs, because politicians constantly use tariffs as an applause line.
They do love to talk about tariffs.
This scenario outlines the use of specific, obscure legal tools. It mentions invoking Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, which would slap a temporary 10% global surcharge on all imports.
Yeah.
And it mentions using Section 232, which deals with national security, to put 100% tariffs on foreign pharmaceuticals.
Right.
The goal here is to point a gun at a global pharmaceutical company and say, build your antibiotic factory in Ohio, or you are legally taxed out of selling to the American consumer.
The political intent is absolute coercion.
Coercion.
It is forcing capital to onshore. But the scenario insists we look at the basic economic accounting of this maneuver.
Right. Who is actually paying for this?
Well, the political rhetoric usually frames a tariff as a way to punish another country, to extract wealth from them.
Oh, yeah, the classic make them pay line.
But the absolute reality of trade law is that foreign countries do not pay U.S. tariffs.
It's the most misunderstood concept in the news.
It really is.
The Chinese government doesn't write a check to the U.S. Treasury when we tariff their goods.
No, the American importer pays the tariff.
Right.
When a shipment of electronics or car parts arrives at the port of Los Angeles, U.S. Customs and Border Protection collects that 10% surcharge directly from the American business importing the goods.
The American business.
Yes. That business then faces a choice. Eat the costs and destroy their profit margin, or pass that 10% cost directly onto the retailer, who then passes it on to the consumer.
So it's essentially a highly regressive national sales tax.
Exactly.
The consumer pays the entry fee for the fortress. When that 10% global surcharge hits under Section 122, it's just a tax shifted onto your grocery bill, your clothing, your kids' school supplies.
It is a mechanism to make foreign goods artificially painful to buy so that more expensive domestic goods can compete.
But the analysis notes this causes immediate chaos.
Yeah. Complete chaos. Small and mid-sized American importers panic because their margins are wiped out overnight.
They just can't absorb a 10% hit.
And there are also severe legal hurdles. The scenario notes that the U.S. Court of International Trade actually ruled the Section 122 tariffs unlawful in the past.
Oh, really?
Yes, because the statute requires a balance of payments deficit,
Which means what?
which is a specific financial crisis, not just a general trade deficit where we buy more than we sell.
Oh, okay. But I'm guessing by the time the courts actually strike it down years later, the chilling effect has already worked.
Exactly. The companies got scared and started building domestic plants anyway to avoid the risk.
But that brings up the physical reality. Tariffs might keep foreign goods out, but how do you actually build the physical infrastructure of a fortress overnight?
That is the massive bottleneck.
Because you can't just snap your fingers and have a state-of-the-art semiconductor fab or a massive chemical refinery suddenly appear in Texas.
No, and this is where the scenario introduces the Weaponization of the Defense Production Act, or the DPA.
The DPA.
Historically, the DTA was used during World War II to force auto plants to build bomber planes, or, more recently during the pandemic, to force the production of ventilators.
Emergency wartime stuff.
Exactly. But in this scenario, it is used as a peacetime economic cudgel to completely bypass standard commercial and regulatory timelines.
Give me a tangible example of that.
Yeah.
What does the DPA actually do to the physical landscape in this model?
According to the projections, the executive branch uses the DPA to force the rapid mandatory overhaul of Gulf Coast oil refineries.
Okay, why?
Historically, those refineries were built to process heavy, sour crude imported from Venezuela or the Middle East.
Right.
The government forces them to instantly retool to process the light, sweet crude pouring out of our domestic Permian Basin.
Thus ensuring immediate domestic fuel security.
Exactly.
But what about the environmental red tape?
Ah, the red tape.
Because anyone who has ever tried to build anything in the United States knows that building a heavy industry usually takes half a decade just in permitting and lawsuits.
Yes. The analysis specifically highlights the gutting of NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act.
Okay, how does NIPA normally work?
NEPA requires exhaustive environmental impact statements for any major infrastructure project. Historically, getting a pipeline or a power plant through a NEPA review can take 5 to 7 years of litigation.
5 to 7 years.
Under this scenario, aggressive executive power is used to crush that timeline down to an unheard of 12 months.
12 months. That is moving at light speed for the federal bureaucracy.
It is basically instantaneous in government time.
So they are fast-tracking permits, opening federal lands, and explicitly protecting baseload power plants, even coal and nuclear. All to guarantee that when these automated factories are finally built, there is actually enough electricity to turn the machines on.
It is a massive, coordinated, top-down rewiring of the physical economy driven entirely by executive fiat.
But here's where the friction gets real.
Always does.
The policies building this fortress, in this scenario, aggressive deregulation, expanding fossil fuels, massive tariffs, those are deeply tied to a specific right-leaning political ideology.
Very deeply tied.
But we don't live in a permanent system. We have elections every 4 years.
We do.
What happens to this grand 2036 blueprint if the political pendulum swings violently? The analysis explores this specific wildcard. What happens if a progressive, far-left administration takes the White House in, say, 2028?
It's a great question.
Do they look at these massive walls, declare them anathema to global cooperation, and just tear them down?
The conclusion on this is quite definitive and I think somewhat surprising. They do not.
They don't.
The concrete is already poured and the walls stay up.
Why? If a new administration fundamentally campaigned against the ideology that built it, why wouldn't they reverse it on day one?
Because of the gravity of sunk costs.
Sunk costs.
The modeling points out that if a progressive administration inherits an economy where hundreds of billions of dollars of private capital have already been spent physically reshoring manufacturing, you cannot simply undo it.
The factories are already there.
Right. If a company just spent $20 billion building a state-of-the-art semiconductor fabrication plant in Arizona, you cannot force them to pack up all that hypersensitive equipment, fire the thousands of American workers, and ship the entire operation back to Taiwan.
It's just not physically or politically feasible.
Exactly. The physical reality on the ground dictates the policy.
And the analysis notes it's not just the physical trap, right? There is actually a deep underlying bipartisan agreement on the core concept of economic nationalism, even if they use different vocabulary.
Yes, absolutely. Mainstream Democrats have already embraced a left-leaning version of this industrial policy.
Oh, what?
The scenario cites the Chi-Chi-Chi-S Act and the Inflation Reduction Act as prime examples of using massive state subsidies to build domestic walls.
Right.
Furthermore, organized labor, which is a foundational constituency for the left, actively supports these trade walls
because tariffs protect high-wage union jobs from cheap foreign competition.
Precisely.
So it's like both sides of the political aisle actually agree on locking the heavy steel gates of the fortress.
They do. They both desperately want to protect American industry.
They just violently disagree on what color to paint the walls inside.
Yes.
And more importantly, they disagree on what kind of power plant is plugging into the extension cord.
That is a perfect way to summarize it. And that divergence is the critical risk identified in the scenario.
Okay, lay it out for me.
The right's version of the fortress runs on maximum oil and gas extraction, slashed corporate taxes, and gutted environmental regulations.
Right. And the left's version?
The left's version of the fortress runs on massive green subsidies, mandatory unionization, and heavy corporate tax hikes to pay for the transition.
And where is the structural landmine in the progressive approach?
The threat is a misalignment of timing. Yes. If a progressive administration successfully uses taxes and regulations to suffocate the domestic fossil fuel industry before grid-scale battery storage and domestic solar and wind are genuinely capable of handling the baseline industrial load,
Oh boy.
the entire economy faces a catastrophic crisis.
Because the power grid fails.
Exactly. An automated, AI-driven industrial base cannot function on intermittent power.
Right, a momentary voltage drop can destroy an entire batch of silicon wafers in a fab.
It ruins the whole batch. If you transition the grid prematurely, you face crippling structural power deficits.
So the multi-billion-dollar factories are built, the robots are ready, but the lights keep flickering and the machines keep shutting down because the sun went down in Nevada, the wind stopped blowing in Texas, and we prematurely dismantled the natural gas plants that used to provide the baseline stability.
That is the specific vulnerability of the rapid transition approach in this model. You break the grid before you've built the replacement.
Okay, so even if the political walls of the fortress remain stable, the economic foundation itself is incredibly fragile.
Very fragile.
The analysis argues there are two massive structural landmines that threaten to blow up this entire 2036 dream from the inside out.
Yes.
Let's look at the first one, which is terrifyingly mathematical. The sovereign debt wall.
This is the macroeconomic nightmare of the scenario.
Break it down for me.
Remember, the entire process of reshoring, building everything domestically with high-wage labor is structurally inflationary.
Right. Things cost more to make here.
So to fight that intense, sticky inflation, the Federal Reserve has no choice but to keep the federal funds rate high.
The era of 0% interest rates is dead forever.
Completely dead.
You have to keep rates high to cool demand, otherwise the cost of everything just spirals out of control.
But keeping interest rates at, say, 5 or 6% triggers a secondary existential crisis regarding the United States national debt.
Oh, because the debt is huge.
The scenario points out that the national debt is rapidly approaching $40 trillion.
$40 trillion.
In a low-interest environment, servicing that debt was manageable. In a high-interest rate environment, the math simply breaks down.
The interest payments alone would be massive.
The scenario highlights a terrifying metric. Under these sustained conditions, the U.S. government would eventually be spending more capital, merely making the interest payments on its past debt, than it spends on the entire national defense budget.
So wait, I'm looking at my mortgage rate right now, and I'm looking at the government.
Yeah.
Are we essentially building this gleaming, state-of-the-art, high-tech fortress on a mountain of high-interest credit card debt?
That is the exact implication.
Right.
You have a robust physical infrastructure, but the sovereign financing underneath it is incredibly precarious.
It severely limits the government's ability to respond to any future crises because every single tax dollar is basically swallowed by interest.
Exactly. And that brings us to the second internal landmine, regulatory whiplash.
Regulatory whiplash.
Yeah.
Which goes right back to the politics we were discussing earlier. The architects are arguing over the blueprints while the cement is drying.
Capital requires certainty, especially at this massive scale.
Okay.
Corporate boards are terrified of the 4-year American election cycle.
Why? I mean, elections happen all the time.
Imagine a CEO considering a $10 billion capital expenditure to build a new heavy manufacturing facility in the Midwest.
Okay.
That facility requires a 20-year operational lifespan just to break even.
Right.
But the CEO hesitates to pull the trigger if they know that a new administration might take power in 48 months and immediately tear down the protective tariffs that make the factory viable against Asian imports.
Or suddenly reinstate strict emissions regulations that make the factory basically illegal to operate.
Exactly.
The political polarization itself becomes an economic paralyzer.
It freezes everything.
You can't build a 30-year industrial strategy on a 4-year political pendulum.
You really can't.
So the CEOs just sit on their cash and wait, which delays the very rebuilding that the fortress depends on.
That is regulatory whiplash. It freezes capital deployment across the board.
Okay, so the United States is struggling internally with a massive debt burden, regulatory paralysis, and a high cost of living. But let's look at how this changes the rest of the map.
Because the ripple effects are global.
Exactly. If the U.S. pulls up the drawbridge, hoards its own capital to pay down that debt, and stops policing the global shipping lanes,
Right.
the dollars stop flowing overseas. And that fundamentally breaks the global strategies of everyone else.
It absolutely shatters them.
Let's look at China. How does Beijing react to the American door slamming shut in their face?
Well, the U.S. fortress model is an existential threat to China's current geopolitical strategy.
Because they need us to buy their stuff.
Right. China's entire economic miracle relies on a predictable, open, globalized world secured by the U.S. Navy, where China can act as the undisputed world's factory.
They need open oceans to import raw materials cheaply and export finished goods globally.
Exactly. But the oceans are no longer safe, and the American consumer isn't buying.
Right. By fortifying the American market and abandoning global maritime security, the U.S. forces China to take on an immense, crippling financial burden.
China suddenly has to sustain its own entirely separate, secure, global network just to survive.
Which they are not set up to do.
No. The scenario points to their massive infrastructure project, the Belt and Road Initiative.
The BRI, which for years was pitched in the West as this grand, offensive imperial tool for Chinese global domination, right?
Exactly.
Like building deep-water ports in Sri Lanka, highways in Africa.
But in this fractured scenario, the BRI morphs into a desperate, defensive insurance policy.
Defensive, how?
Because China can no longer rely on maritime trade, which is incredibly cheap but highly vulnerable to blockades. As we discussed, they must use the BRI to frantically secure overland rail networks through Central Asia.
Right.
And overland energy pipelines from Russia.
But overland transport is vastly more expensive and inefficient than shipping.
It's hugely inefficient, but it's defensively necessary just to keep their factories running and prevent domestic collapse.
So it turns from a profitable expansion into a massive sunk cost.
Exactly. It's an anchor around their neck.
What happens to the Middle East in all of this?
The Middle East.
If the U.S. is sitting comfortably behind its walls, running on domestic shale oil and gas from Texas and the Dakotas, we don't care about the Strait of Hormuz anymore.
Not our problem.
We pull our aircraft carriers out of the Gulf. What does that region look like without the American policemen?
The analysis describes a brutal, highly pragmatic realignment.
Pragmatic how?
The Gulf states, primarily Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, recognize that the U.S. is no longer their primary customer and therefore no longer their reliable protector.
So who do they turn to?
They explicitly tie their economic survival to the nations that still desperately need their oil: East Asia and India.
Okay, but selling oil to China doesn't solve their immediate security threat.
No, it doesn't.
I mean, they still have Iran sitting right across the Gulf funding proxy militias. Without the U.S. military umbrella, how do the Gulf states survive militarily? This leads to the most fascinating geopolitical shift in this scenario.
It's a huge shift. What happens to Israel?
Israel adapts to the U.S. withdrawal by becoming the undisputed military and technological hegemon of the Levant.
Hegemon.
Yes. And crucially, without the U.S. constantly leaning on them, Israel becomes completely unshackled from the need for Western diplomatic approval.
Oh, they don't have to worry about Washington pausing weapon shipments over human rights concerns or political optics.
Precisely. They are completely independent. And this reality forces the formation of a cold, hard, entirely unsentimental military alliance between Israel and the Gulf states.
Really? A military alliance?
It is a marriage of absolute survival. The Gulf states provide incredibly deep pools of sovereign wealth capital.
They have the money.
And Israel provides the elite cyber technology, the advanced missile defense systems like Iron Dome and David's Sling, and the operational military muscle.
So they team up. Together, they form an impenetrable bloc designed for one single purpose: keeping Iran permanently contained.
So to summarize the sheer scale of the shift we've mapped out today,
It's massive.
the Middle East essentially becomes a self-contained unit dealing with its own security allying elite Israeli military tech with massive Saudi money to box in Iran.
Yes.
Iran is basically reduced to being a cheap, heavily sanctioned resource vassal feeding a desperate China.
Mm.
China is frantically trying to build inefficient overland railroads to survive because their maritime export engine is broken.
Right.
And the American fortress is sitting behind high-tariff walls, running on high-tech automation, struggling with massive domestic debt, and paying double for their groceries.
That's the reality of 2036.
That is a total, fundamental rewiring of the globe we all grew up in.
It is the absolute end of the post-Cold War era.
It really is.
It returns the world to a much more regional, transactional, and hard-edged reality, where geography and domestic supply chains are the only things that guarantee a nation's survival.
We've covered an immense amount of ground today.
We certainly have.
We started by dismantling the myth of the solid blockade, realizing that a crisis in Hormuz acts as a leaky sieve and a grinding structural tax.
Yep.
We watched that tax force Europe into industrial triage, sending their heavy manufacturing fleeing to the U.S. Gulf Coast, while simultaneously stalling out China's export engine.
And out of that global friction, we traced the architecture of the 2036 Fortress America, a domestic boom in AI and robotics, coupled with the permanent death of cheap consumer goods.
Right. We looked at the geopolitical trap of the green transition, highlighting China's massive monopoly on lithium processing.
Which is huge.
And we saw how the U.S. government uses brutal executive cudgels, legally dubious tariffs, and the Defense Production Act to bulldoze environmental red tape and force capital back onshore.
Finally, we examine the internal cracks in the fortress, the paralyzing effect of regulatory whiplash, and a $38 trillion debt wall.
While watching the rest of the world, from Beijing to Jerusalem, frantically realign into hardened, self-interested survival blocks.
It's a completely different world.
I want to remind you listening right now that while we are talking about macroeconomics and global grand strategy, none of this is abstract theory.
No, it's very real.
The mechanics we unpack today dictate the granular reality of the next decade of your life.
Absolutely.
This geopolitical shift dictates the availability and type of jobs that will be there for your kids when they graduate. It dictates the structural baseline cost of the milk and eggs in your shopping cart.
It does.
And it absolutely dictates the long-term interest rates attached to your 30-year mortgage. The global shifts we discussed are intimately, unavoidably local.
They touch everything.
But I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder, something that builds on the fundamental premise of this scenario.
Okay.
The projections describe a 2036 where tangible, local production is king. Nations wall themselves off to protect their own natural resources, their own power grids, and their own workers.
Right, it's all about self-preservation.
And it makes complete logical sense in a dangerous, fractured world to pull up the drawbridge.
It does.
But if the entire globe fractures into these heavily guarded, self-contained fortresses, what happens to the velocity of global innovation?
Oh, that's a great point.
Because science and technology thrive on collaboration, on cross-border peer review, on the messy collision of different cultures and ideas.
They need that exchange.
Does an insulated Fortress America, cut off from the friction-filled, free-flowing global exchange of international talent, eventually risk becoming a highly secure, incredibly well-funded technological island that entirely misses out on the next great leap forward in human discovery?
It's a very real risk.
Something to think about. We'll see you next time.